There are some murder cases. Even talking about them is unsettling. Because in this case file, it wasn't only murdered women. There was torture. There were dismembered bodies. And the police weren't even sure whether what they were seeing was the work of a single killer. In the early 1980s, young women began to disappear in Chicago. Some were found weeks later, some months later. And the bodies that were found left behind only one question. What kind of person could do this? The press quickly gave this killer a name: the Chicago Ripper. But the truth was far darker than what the newspapers wrote. Because the question wasn't only, who is the killer? The real question was this: was one person responsible for this brutality, or were there multiple monsters roaming the streets of Chicago? And as the investigation deepened, the police would find themselves not in an ordinary serial killer case, but inside a nightmare surrounded by claims of torture, perversion, and ritual. It all began with a single missing woman report. In 1981, Linda Sutton disappeared. 10 days later, her body was found. The details on her body showed this wasn't an ordinary murder. Something had been taken. A mark had been left. As if the killer hadn't been satisfied with just killing. But the police had almost nothing. No solid witness, and no clue that would lead them directly to a suspect. And maybe the most dangerous thing was this: the police didn't yet know this was only the beginning. A year passed. Then Lorraine Borowski disappeared. She was supposed to open the workplace in the morning, but the office door was locked. Her shoes were outside. The contents of her bag were scattered around. This scene didn't look like a sudden disappearance. It looked like a struggle cut short. Months later, her body was found too. And now there were two women in the file. Two disappearances. Two horrific endings. And a shared darkness becoming clearer and clearer. Then more names began to appear. Tremak, Sandra Delaware, Rose Davis. With each new victim, the police noticed the files were starting to look more and more alike. But that similarity wasn't bringing them any closer to the killer. On the contrary, as the file grew, the darkness became even more complex. What made this file truly horrifying was that some victims hadn't died, because the survivors could tell what had happened inside. One woman said she was abducted, forced into a vehicle, handcuffed and tortured, and then left for dead, but she hadn't died. Another woman had been attacked in a similar way and escaped at the last moment. These accounts gave the police their first idea of the mindset behind the murders. This wasn't just killing. There was preparation. There was control. There was pleasure in causing pain. The women seemed to be chosen at random, but the method of attack wasn't random. It was planned, almost a repeating ritual. And that was the most disturbing detail. The killer, or killers, didn't look like they were doing this for the first time. The bodies left around Chicago seemed to carry a single message: this isn't over. The real turning point the police had been waiting for came from a victim who survived, badly injured. When Beverly Washington was found, she was still breathing. Surviving the attack changed the direction of the case, because for the first time, the police had found not just a body, but a witness who could speak. The information she gave led them to a name: Robin Gecht. At first glance, he wasn't someone who stood out. An unemployed carpenter. A strange one. Someone with disturbing allegations in his past. But as the investigation deepened, his circle began to come into view too. And here, the case shifted into a completely different dimension. Because there were other names around Gecht. Men who knew each other. Men who moved in the same circles. men gathered around similar dark allegations involving women. The police began to think they might not be chasing just one serial killer, and that possibility made the case far more terrifying. The darkest part of the investigation began here, and in Robin Gecht's past, an unexpected name appeared: John Wayne Gacy. A former employee of one of the most notorious serial killers in history. Had darkness drawn darkness in? No one could know for sure. The police learned the suspects had stayed at the same motel for a time. The manager said they brought women in and out. But what truly unsettled him was something else. To him, these men weren't ordinary. After a while, one of the suspects began to crack, and what he told them caught even the police off guard. Allegedly, there was a room set aside in a house. It wasn't an ordinary crime scene. It was like a place where so-called rituals were carried out. Women were held there, subjected to torture, sexually assaulted by multiple perpetrators, and ultimately killed. As the statements continued, the file became even more nauseating. The police were no longer investigating only the murders, but also a deviant group structure involving the concealment of human remains, alleged acts of cannibalism, and the practice of ritual-like behaviors. At this point, the question changed. Was there a serial killer in Chicago, or an organized circle of brutality? And this is exactly where the public's fear spiraled out of control. Because if what was said was true, what was roaming the city wasn't just a killer. This depraved group was hunting together. The police finally moved. Raids were carried out, suspects were detained one by one, and searches began in the homes. The items found, the statements taken, and what the surviving victims described gradually clarified the structure at the center of the case. 4 names, 4 arrests, and the end of a darkness that had been growing in the city for years. At some point, authorities began to think this group may have killed many more women. The number was growing, the case was growing. But certainty was still missing, because not every victim could be clearly linked. Not every confession was complete. Not every detail could be verified. And that made the case even more terrifying. The police had reached some answers, but there was still so much left in the dark. And sometimes, partially solved cases are more frightening than fully solved ones. When the trial began, the horror uncovered by the investigation was laid before the public. The survivors' accounts, the suspects' statements, the evidence seized from the homes. All of it, one by one, entered the court record. Robin Gecht was found guilty of attacking the victims and was sentenced to 120 years in prison. Andrew Kokorales confessed to 17 murders and was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection. His brother Thomas Kokorales received a life sentence, later reduced to 70 years. Edward Spreitzer accepted responsibility in multiple murder cases and received the death penalty, later commuted to life imprisonment. The men in the case were being convicted one by one, but even so, it didn't feel finished. Because the most unsettling thing in this case wasn't only the sentences. What was truly unsettling was that no verdict could illuminate the whole file. How many victims were there, and how deep did the dark structure at the center of this group go? The court ruled, but the case didn't fully close. Some questions kept living on even after the verdict. Thomas Kokorales was released from prison decades later. In 2019, he was free. In front of cameras, he said only one thing: "Everyone thinks I'm a monster. I'm not a monster." Did anyone believe him? The answer to that question stayed in the file. What made the Chicago Ripper file chilling wasn't only the brutality of the murders. What made this case different was the possibility that evil wasn't contained in a single body. A serial killer is frightening, but multiple people joining in the same darkness is something else entirely. This wasn't only murder. There was the possibility of sadism carried out collectively. There was depravity presented as belief. And there was a mindset that reduced the human body to an ordinary object. Maybe this was exactly the most frightening part of the file. What's roaming the streets of Chicago may not be a single monster. Sometimes darkness wears more than one face.